A green-haired girl named Phoenix walked into an Italian restaurant and was told to wait in the lobby. Despite the reservation that she had made months ago, she waited for more than an hour. There were many employees rolling the restaurant, yet there was no reason for them to row. There were very few customers in the restaurant, and it quickly became apparent to Phoenix that they were attempting to ignore her completely. Some of them were trying to get a glimpse of her dyed scalp. The employees' eyes gleamed with mischief, and they walked past her in groups as they whispered mean things about her. The blonde, tall, and proper young beauty named Daisy-eyed Phoenix would disgust in the curl lip. Daisy has worked in the restaurant for the past 6 months, and she was so proud of her place of work. Look at her, she looks like she's got seaweed on her head. Daisy, she's growing a garden from that nasty scalp. Jake, another waiter, after an hour of patiently waiting, saw a lavishly dressed woman with a man in a suit enter the restaurant. A waiter immediately approached them and let them sit at one of the tables. Phoenix raised an eyebrow. She'd made a reservation, waited for an hour, and was starving. The beggar's name was not on their exclusive list. Daisy trolled with repulsion. Phoenix's name was on the list and written with an asterisk next to it. Andiaggio in Italy only reserved these asterisks for the most important of customers. The waitress was certain that this cycle had murdered Phoenix, saw the reservation on her calendar, and showed up at her place. I need to see some form of identification. Ma'am Phoenix took a step back. She was baffled. She had been to this restaurant many times in the distant past, and they had never asked for her identification before. They hadn't asked a customer before her for identification either, so it wasn't as if their policies had changed since the last time she'd been here, considering the amount of time that she'd been forced to wait and endure their insults. She had hoped that they would at least see her quickly now that they'd found her name on the list. I haven't seen you ask for anyone else's identification. I gave you my name, and I've been here many times before. Daisy laughed, and her shrill laughter rang throughout the restaurant. The customers that were seated watched, and they treated it like a dine-in theater. Everybody was interested in what the waitress would do to this woman, who clearly did not belong in a restaurant like this, Mississippi. I can assure you that you have not been here before. I would have remembered someone like you. Now I must see identification, or I'm going to have to ask you to leave and then probably call the authorities to report identity theft. Phoenix couldn't believe it. She'd been going here for years. She knew most of the waiters, but they didn't recognize her due to her disheveled state. Despite her wound pride, she removed her license from her pocket and handed it to Daisy. She was too hungry to argue with her. It was dinner time, and it was her first meal of the day. Daisy arched a perfectly trimmed eyebrow, and she blinked confusedly at her license. Phoenix stared directly at her, and she hoped that she'd received the apology that she deserved, but instead the woman shrugged and let her through. Perhaps if you'd come here dressed like your license photo, we wouldn't have had so many issues. Keep that in mind for next time, darling, said Daisy with a tense smile. Phoenix hung her head low as the customers whispered and pointed at her. Not a single one of them attempted to hide their interest in her. There were many waiters that were free to attend to her, but they pretended not to notice her, and she was forced to seat herself. She looked down at her attire. She wore a ripped wide shirt that had scuff marks on it and green cargo pants with paint stains on them. There were a pair of broken yellow sandals on her dirty feet. Her stomach grumbled, and she searched the restaurant for a waiter that would meet her gaze. Eventually, she found one, and she waved them over. The waiter, Jake, walked over to her slowly, contempt written across his face. The young, lanky man shook his head with a smirk. What are you going to order? A glass of water with a piece of lettuce. I'm afraid the prices here might overwhelm you. In other words, I don't think he can afford anything here. Phoenix clenched her jaw and hardened her gaze. My meal has already been paid for. On the list, there is an asterisk next to my name, and that is the reason for it. You didn't even provide me with a menu, but I have been here before, so there is no need. I'd like the gnocchi with a side of garlic bread. In addition to that, I would like a margarita pizza medium. Jake had no reason to not believe her, as they would not have allowed her into the VIP section if she wasn't a VIP guest, but what concerned him was the amount of food that she was ordering. There had to have been someone else on the way who would share the food with her. Perhaps it would be one of those rich men who were attracted to poorer females that they could take advantage of. She was definitely homeless and unable to afford their services, yet her food had already been paid in advance. He had paid such a large sum for this ugly and smelly woman due to his fear that an older rich man would show up and complain that he hadn't served his lady. Jake nodded promptly and fetched Phoenix her food on his way back to the kitchen. Jake was stopped by his manager. Denny, the hairy buff Italian, had been watching Phoenix from a distance and analyzing whether she was a threat or not. "What are you doing bringing that freak her food? She's on the VIP list." Denny stared at the Phoenix and shook his head resolutely. The woman was dirty, and she was wearing ripped, smelly clothing. It simply was not good for business. "Give her the food and a couple of takeout boxes, and get her out of here." Jake sighed with relief and did exactly what Vinny said. He was not used to dealing with what he called such a low-class customer. The customer had been quite kind to him despite their circumstances, but in their eyes, she was ferociously ugly. Her hair was a stinging neon green, she was covered in dirt, and she had extremely plain features. The customers that Jake often dealt with were rich and beautiful, and that made customer service worth its many struggles. Jake approached the table with brown takeout boxes and a smug smirk. Phoenix had waited for her food for 2 hours by now, and her stomach was in knots when she saw her food in boxes. She knew exactly what it was, but she asked anyway to confirm her suspicions. "What is this?" croaked Phoenix, as she pleadingly looked up at Jake. Jake looked at her without a hint of remorse and said, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave, ma'am. We don't tolerate your kind of people here." Phoenix couldn't believe it. She had grown up in this establishment, and now that her circumstances weren't as favorable as before, the same people that had treated her with so much kindness were now treating her like a stranger. The only thing that was noticeably different about her was her appearance. Yet it seemed that to them it was the only thing that mattered. They had not loved Phoenix for who she truly was, as at her core, Phoenix didn't want to humiliate herself further, so she grabbed the boxes of takeout and quietly began to head out without any protest. She was stopped by Vinny before she could exit the venue. "Excuse me," the gruff man, "you need to pay, man." "I already did." She explained that surely it was in their records. "I'm going to need proof of payment," Vinny demanded with crossed arms. Phoenix shook her head, and tears spilled down her pale cheeks. The poor girl simply wanted to eat a hot meal. Her life had turned into shambles, and this meal was the one comfort that she could still look forward to. There were endless obstacles in her way when all she wanted was to have some food in her empty stomach. Phoenix met the man's eyes. It was hoped that some humanity would shine through Vinny. She had done what they said, she had patiently waited, and now she was leading the establishment. There was no need for conflict. Frankly, she no longer had the strength for such a thing. "Please just let me go. I have already paid. I've been here before," she whispered. "I just look a bit different, and you don't remember, but I always pay my dues. I'm starving, and I want to leave. Please let me go." Red and blue lights flashed against the large floor-to-ceiling windows open Diego and Natalia. Phoenix's eyes glazed over with terror, and Vinny smiled sinister smile in response. He'd called the cops the moment that this beast of a woman had entered their establishment. They had worked extremely intelligently to ensure that their restaurant was a place of value in the class. They had never had a homeless, poor, and dirty person into their restaurant before. If they allowed this to slide, then it would encourage more homeless people like her to hang around their area, and this would cheapen the place. They had to nip this in the bud before it progressed. He was certain that there was a record of her payment. He checked, but he had to teach shameless people like her that there were certain prerequisites that one had to meet to enter a restaurant. These standards regarding their clientele created the ambience of their restaurant, which they were nothing without allowing this woman to dine with customers that had paid great amounts of money to experience their ambience, and not have to look at a helpless, smelly, and dirty pig would end up costing them a lot of money, and money was the priority in business. If they needed to clean up their beautiful luxury restaurant by removing the homeless, then so be it. As long as Vinny continued to get his checks at the end of the month, he was content. If he allowed this woman to water their food without any consequences for her sloppiness, then he might be fired, and then they would both be homeless. There was nothing that he could do to help her in this situation, not to mention that the power that he had to remove her was quite thrilling, and he didn't want to lose such power. "You need help, ma'am. You retire, and lack of hygiene clearly suggests that you've had some type of mental breakdown. Such things are not allowed in this restaurant, but that's the least of it," said Vinny, "and truthfully, we cannot see you in such a state without trying to help you get better. Arun Biagio and Ataya integrity is our motto." Phoenix knew that this was extremely far from the truth. She knew each and every one of these workers intimately since her childhood. She had done so here, and even hung out with some of the staff behind the scenes. She had silently watched as staff members ridiculed customers and analyzed their every move for scrutiny. The gossip that they circulated brought them heaps of pleasure. Phoenix had never participated in their cruelty, and she often found it to be wrong, but she never fully understood her feelings because she had never been bullied herself. All she knew was her placement with the elite, which she had inherited now that she was no longer in their inner circle. She fully saw just how unjust their wealth and subsequent judgment were. She was certain that they were not doing this because of their values. They were enjoying the humiliation despite the kindness that she'd shown them and the history that they shared. She couldn't have been more humiliated as the police officer handcuffed her and dragged her away. At the end of the day, she didn't even get to enjoy the food that she had paid for. She was forced to be driven away in a squad car as the appetizing and hunger-inducing smells of the restaurant faded away. The only thing that she could do was think that there had to be a way out of this. The only way to find the solution to all of this was to go back to her roots. Phoenix had grown up rich, but her life hadn't been as happy as it seemed. Outsiders saw the facade that had been carefully built for her. She had every object that money could buy, including an incredible education in a large circle of friends. The reality was quite the opposite. Her parents hadn't inherited their wealth, and they were forced to work endlessly to keep up with their spending habits. Her parents were obsessed with other people's perceptions of them. Therefore, the loss of their fortune signified the loss of their worth. Their extreme poverty and their difficult rise left them scarred, and these unhealed wounds led to them abusing Phoenix. They were so terrified of her experiencing poverty that they were extremely hard on her and withheld their affection, in an effort to harden her demeanor for business purposes. Their efforts to maintain their wealthy appearance kept them away from home for the majority of the time. Phoenix was raised by a nanny, and the few times that her parents were at home, their interactions weren't positive. In her parents' eyes, Phoenix was never enough, and she would never possess what it took to maintain their fortune. They called her many things, such as stupid, ugly, and pudgy, and they never had a kind word to say. While most parents encouraged their children to persevere in life, Phoenix's parents degraded her and convinced her to settle because they didn't believe that she was capable of any significant success. They showered her with love in public, but in private, they encouraged her to marry rich and take up as little space as possible. This completely warped her perspective on reality and her sense of self. The truth was that Phoenix was not ugly. She was so beautiful that even at her worst, she was not ugly at all. There was nothing she could have done to be enough for her parents, because her parents were not even enough for themselves. Eventually, Phoenix got married to the man of their choice, and she spent her days cleaning and cooking for her husband. This marriage was not based on love. Their respective families simply liked the prospect of their union, and they arranged their marriage. Her husband, Chris, only agreed because her family possessed significant wealth that he could take advantage of. He wasn't attracted to her in the slightest. In fact, he was secretly in the closet. Chris did not enjoy women at all, not even a beautiful girl like Phoenix, and he'd often drink the pain of a secret away. Chris was never sober. He used drugs, drank, and spent time with other men rather than spending time with his beautiful wife. The few times that he did come home, he launched abusive insults at her. "You're a disgusting fat piece of, and you belong in the kitchen. You're so incredibly lucky that I settled for you." These were the kind of things that her husband would say to her, and they barely affected her because these insults were quite similar to the way that her parents spoke to her. It was all that she knew until she met a girl named Carmen one day while shopping. She bumped into Carmen, and they shared a few laughs upon noticing that their shopping carts had identical items in them. Carmen was the very first person that Phoenix told of the abuse. Carmen told Phoenix quite clearly that the way she was being treated was not permissible, and they worked together to find an escape route for her. Carmen treated Phoenix the way that she deserved to be treated, with a lot of kindness and respect, and she showed her how to love herself properly. With time, she healed enough to find a way out of her predicament. Phoenix divorced her husband and blocked her parents from her life, but this came with great consequences. Her parents hadn't allowed her to receive an education, and she fully depended on her parents and husband to provide her income. Now that she was on her own and didn't communicate with her parents, she had nothing to her name and no degree that she could get a job with the little money left after the divorce was gone too. She was living on the streets because all the homeless shelters were full. The last few months had been spent searching for a job to no avail. It was a tight job market, and she had no skills. She had depended on others for so long, and she didn't know how to provide for herself without help. Carmen had shown her in many ways that she was capable, and she didn't want to disappoint her, so she made do with the little money that she had left until she had nothing at all. The restaurant reservation had been made months ago, before life took a drastic turn for Phoenix. Now it was the only thing left from her luxurious life, and it broke her heart that after so much struggle, she couldn't even enjoy that she had to walk for several hours in the ceaseless heat to arrive at the restaurant. She hadn't spoken to Carmen in months, but she had no choice. All of her friends had been placed in her life by her parents, except for her. Now that she cut them off and lost a financial prosperity that was attractive to her friends, she had nobody else that could bail her out. There was nothing else that she could possibly do. There was nobody else to go to with a heavy heart. Carmen, hey, what's up, P? I haven't heard from you in forever. I miss you, dude. Carmen, I'm in jail. I tried to get food at Un Diego in Italy, and they called the cops on me because I came in looking like I'm homeless, which I am. It's a long story. Phoenix glanced at the inmates behind her who were waiting to use the phone, and she sighed. Carmen gasped, but not at what Phoenix had expected. He went to Indiago, Italy. Phoenix, you've got to be kidding me, that's what caught you by surprise. Carmen, I'm in jail. No, you don't understand. My father owns the place. I'm going to ask him to bail you out and fire whoever was responsible for this. Just give me a second. Phoenix was bailed out of jail within the next few hours. Carmen's father was an extremely kind person, and he was not there when this incident occurred when he discovered that his employees humiliated the less fortunate. When he wasn't around, he was livid. Tony had earned his fortune, he grew up poor. He knew exactly what it felt like to go hungry and be desperate for help, and he would have no part in harming Phoenix in the same way that he had been harming and discouraging Vinny. Daisy and Jay, his two former employees, stood there, and they shook with the name just as Phoenix had when they humiliated her. You three are despicable, you bullied her and kicked her out. She was a paying customer. This is completely unacceptable. Please apologize to her for this instant and get the hell out of my restaurant. Phoenix watched as Vinny, Jake, and Daisy's eyes collectively flashed terror. It reminded her of how she'd felt when she'd cut off her financial support. They lived in a very difficult economic period, and she wouldn't wish homelessness on anyone. She had lost everything, but she had sworn long ago to never harm anyone, and this was no exception. She would never allow herself to be as cruel as her parents. She needed to find a way to guarantee that they learned their lesson, yet maintained the ability to pay their bills. This wasn't just about them, this was about any family member of theirs that might become involved in this mess. I had an idea. Perhaps we can turn this into a learning opportunity. I could make a training course that will ensure that your employees don't mistreat any customers, and they can get them testimonies as to the consequences and what they learned from this. Tony believed this to be a good idea, but he was skeptical. Phoenix, do you think you're qualified to teach a course like that? Phoenix stared at the ground ejaculatory. He was right. She had no qualifications to speak of, but Carmen had a different opinion. Her friend hadn't studied much, but she possessed life experience that was much more important. This could be an opportunity to use those experiences in exchange for something more valuable. Dad, she may not have the qualifications, but she has personally experienced mistreatment and homelessness. She knows it much more intimately than anything a textbook can teach her. You don't even have to pay her. Just fund her studies in exchange for the course. Phoenix stared at her friend with incredulity. What made her believe that her father would do such a thing? It was way too generous of a prospect, to her surprise. Tony immediately agreed that he had experienced poverty as well, and generous mentors had helped with access to education that he needed to succeed in life. He felt that it was his duty to pass that on. You see, both Tony and Phoenix's parents had experienced poverty, yet Tony was a good person who helped others and contributed to charity. Circumstances had been equally grim, yet the end resulted in dramatically different lives and temperaments. At the end of the day, bad things happen to all of us, but whether they strengthen us or define us is up to us. Denny, Daisy, and Jake watched Phoenix, and they seemed to be viewing her as a human being for the first time. They mumbled their apologies and headed out. Phoenix was stunned. She would never have to go hungry again, and she would never have to depend on the abuse of people to maintain herself. From now on, she was in charge of her own life. She was finally in control. Late that night, they had a party to celebrate the start of her new job. There was only one rule for the dress code. Everyone had to wear green wigs so that Phoenix would no longer feel like an outsider. Little did they know, she dyed her hair green because her hair was falling out due to malnutrition, and the green dye was the only thing that could hide her hair loss in the end. Tony decided to allow Phoenix to live with them in their spacious house, and he funded her studies. She reminded him of a younger version of himself. She was unfortunate, yet she was kind and patient with everyone that she met, and he admired this greatly. Tony knew that she deserved all of her struggles to be worthwhile when Phoenix joined their household. She cooked for them many times, ironically. Tony was often too busy managing his restaurant to want to cook. Phoenix's culinary talents were clear from the start, and Tony suggested that she go to culinary school rather than college. Phoenix was kind, beautiful, and intelligent. She was good enough for Carmen and Tony. The love and support that she received from them bolstered her confidence, and she blossomed into the best version of herself. Tony personally trained her, and she spent the next few years in culinary school. Under Tony's mentorship, she became an excellent chef. Between her kindness, intellect, and talent, she was destined to open her own restaurant one day. She eventually did that, and she ensured to hire as many less fortunate people as possible. A third of her proceeds were donated to a homeless shelter fund, and she eventually opened her own shelter as well. Business was booming due to her excellent leadership skills, and that shelter was funded quite quickly. Before all of this, she labored to transform Tony's restaurant for the better. She wanted to ensure that nobody suffered mistreatment, the same way that she had once they personally interacted with her. Jake and Daisy realized that she wasn't so bad after all. It became clear to them that financial circumstances did not determine character. The old made sure to undo their mistakes. In fact, they managed several of Phoenix's restaurants. Many years later, she hired them to make sure that her restaurant chain retained the integrity that she valued. She trusted them because she had personally taught them the importance of integrity in the past. They developed a stable partnership and trusted each other to top it all off. Phoenix encountered her parents at her main restaurant one day. They apologized and explained that they decided to attend therapy in order to better themselves before reaching out to her. Now that their wounds were healed, her parents were completely different people. They loved Phoenix for who she was, and they proved to her that they deserved another chance. Phoenix had two different support systems, Tony's family and her own biological family. She finally felt loved, and in the end, the universe rewarded Phoenix for her integrity and her kindness.